Okay, that was different. All right, it's Barb. I'm here. We're live. Donna is not here, as you can tell by the technical errors. But we have a special guest today. This is New York Times bestselling author Shirley Jump, who is also the author of Writing Compelling Fiction. Hi, Shirley.
Hi, Barb. How are you?
How are you
Good to be
doing?
here. I'm missing Donna, but that's okay.
I know, but we're very excited because Shirley's an awesome teacher. And we're going to be talking about, I'm going to add this up, but we're going to be talking about 5 mistakes you're making with setting. But first, we're going to talk about writing compelling fiction.
Awesome. Look at that.
Tell us a little bit about it. Yeah.
So, writing compelling fiction is all about write a better book, as my shirt says, as I'm representing the company here. Writing compelling fiction is just so people know that URL is wrong on there. It should be writingcompellingfiction.com. I might have given you the wrong one. Um, Writing Compelling Fiction is a channel that has a mastermind, has classes, has all kinds of things. It's based on the how-to book that I have, but the channel on YouTube offers all kinds of classes on goal motivation and conflict, on inspiration to get to start writing, on writer's block, on imposter syndrome, all of those kinds of things. We're kind of taking all of these things that I wish I knew when I first started writing and putting it out there so you guys don't have to write 10 books in 8 years like I did before you sell the first one.
So now is the YouTube channel youtube.com writing compelling fiction or at
Yes,
writing
yes.
compelling fiction?
Yeah,
Okay.
all of the social media is at writing compelling fiction, except for Twitter because they don't give you enough letters. So it's compelling fic over there. Everywhere else, we're
All
on
right.
Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, and LinkedIn and YouTube at writing compelling fiction.
I will make sure all the correct links are in the notes.
Awesome.
So everyone will
Thank
get
you.
them. I can vouch. I've known Shirley for years. I've taken some of her classes. I can vouch that she really knows what she's talking about. And like I said, today she's going to be talking about things about setting, but more importantly, mistakes that new writers make. So, what would you say are the top 5 mistakes? Which coincidentally, I have slides on. So,
Right? So I feel like there's a quiz now. So let's talk about the first one, which is describing too much of the things that don't. I didn't memorize my 5. Top one is describing too much of the things that don't matter to the plot. So one of the things that I tell people, and they think that this is crazy, every word in the book, every word of dialogue, every word of description must move the plot forward. Otherwise, you don't need it there. And I prove this to people by picking up a copy of Guess How Much I Love You, which is the Little Nut Brown Hair and Big Nut Brown Hair. It's like 400 words. And every single word in that children's story moves that plot forward. There's nothing wasted, no descriptions that are wasted, no dialogue that is wasted, because the reader is giving you hours of their life in order to read this book, and you want to give them value for that. So everything that the character describes or looks at or thinks about should have some kind of impact on their internal plot or their external plot. So there's got to be a reason for it. People don't just randomly describe things. If you look at how you look around a room, you don't just randomly go, oh, look at that really cool red book if you don't even think about books and you don't read. So it has to be something that propels the plot forward.
okay. Now, we should pause here and say that there's 3 different levels of setting. So, you have your well, there's the time setting, especially
Mm-hmm.
for historical fiction or any other type. There's the overall environment, and that which is your
Mm-hmm.
macro setting, and then you have your individual settings in each scene. So most
Right.
writers, I think, are familiar with describing the individual scenes, but how would
Mm-hmm.
you weave in bigger things like time and environment without going overboard, but getting enough world building to make it move the plot
So you want
forward?
to look at it's about the emotional impact too, right? Like I've had scenes where a character is telling the other character something that's very personal or a big secret or something like that. And when you have that, you can use your setting to offset that tension in the room, like the fire crackling in between or things that the character would notice or walk away to or look at. All of those little teeny tiny details can be evocative of what's going on. If you look at, say, news coverage of something like a hurricane, with a hurricane, they can have the flyover where there's, hundreds of houses flattened. And yes, that's sad. And you're like, oh, too bad for those people. But when the reporter zeroes in on this one little kid clutching a teddy bear and crying, that's when we start to give money and want to help and show up at blood banks and all of that, because that micro detail, that little kid whose life was devastated out of thousands and thousands of people, is the one that causes people to connect emotionally. That's what you always want to build, is that emotional connection with the reader. So you zero in on the things that make sense in that moment, and make sense to the characters, the way the character works internally. Like men are going to notice different things than women do, and make sense to the plot.
Okay, I hold that thought 'cause we're gonna go into more detail on that, but you said that you told me that mistake number 2 is having characters notice things that don't matter to them. Um,
Right. So
and I
this is when they're
actually witnessed this today listening to some things where it was they spend a lot of time describing stuff that didn't which great description, but not necessarily of importance.
right. Because when you meet a character, they are in media res, as that says there, which is a Latin term for in the middle of their lives. And the middle of their lives, they're not necessarily noticing all the details. Descriptions have to be triggered, just like backstory has to be triggered. Those two kind of go in hand in hand. Like I will notice somebody is baking bread if I smell the bread, right? Or and I will think of my mother baking bread as when I was a kid when I see somebody baking bread. So that those things go hand in hand. A guy character is probably not going to notice the tufting in the sofa, right? Or the little kind of flowers are on there. Most guys are have no idea whatsoever. And a woman may or may not know what kind of nails they use to put the deck together. Like these are details that may not make sense to your character. So don't have your character know or notice things that do not make sense to them. And above that, too, if it's a really emotional moment or a big high stakes action moment, they're not going to pay attention. I remember being in a workshop one time with Cheryl St. John, I think it was, where she had us act out a shooting scene. And she had, they're all of the bad guys in the Western are just shooting at each other. And then she pauses everybody. She freezes the character, people playing the characters in the room, so that one character can sit back and think about his dear departed girlfriend and look around and notice this guy's hat and that guy's boots. You're being shot at. You don't have time for that. Like in that moment, is that something that character is going to notice? Does it make sense at all to have 3 paragraphs of description in the middle of a gunfight? No, it does not.
Okay. Well, and I'm going to say as we move up to number 3, it also this is where knowing your character is important.
Exactly. Yes.
Because as far as going back to like what things matter to them, what you're going to notice in the heat of the moment might be different than what, say, a special ops guy is going to notice in the heat of the moment,
Exactly.
or an old lady.
Right. Right. Like you and I have both written characters, and you did it such a good job because I used your character as a basis to study for my character that had PTSD from the war. And when he's laying under this car and another car fires, he goes through that whole moment, and he kind of has to ground himself in all of the details of where he's at to remind himself that he's not in Iraq. He's underneath the car fixing a Monte Carlo. So the setting has to have an impact on the character that makes sense. So if he's triggered by that, then that's going to have an emotional impact on him, and he's going to have to react somehow. If you have a claustrophobic character and they go into a small room, it's going to have an impact. If you have a character who goes back to her hometown and her childhood bedroom, and she had a horrible childhood, there are going to be elements, every inch of that bedroom, and elements in that bedroom will have an impact on her. For instance, I have a character, not a character, I have a client who is writing a book where she talked about being attacked, sexually attacked by somebody. And there's one detail that she remembers because she was a little girl when it happened. And that one detail is the only thing that she really holds on to as evocative of that moment. So when she sees that kind of thing in her real life, that triggers all that and brings it all back. So if you're going to write a character, you're going to have a setting and you want to have an impact on the character with that place that they're going to, you need to take a few minutes to discover who that character is and why that setting would have an impact on them. What happened to them when they were younger?
How do you decide?
References back to that.
How do you decide what your character is going to hone in on? Because
So if you know them, then you know that this is somebody who's afraid of being abandoned, or this is somebody who's out for blood, or this is somebody who is very vulnerable, right? And you've got to think that through. Look, people that you know, the movies that you've seen, the books you've read, the TV shows that you've seen. How does a person who feels very vulnerable because they were attacked as a child react in this particular place, or would react with somebody looming over them or somebody startling them? Compared to, say, a guy who served in the military, how is he going to react to being in a small space or somebody threatening him? They have totally different reactions. So you've got to look at what their past will automatically make them, what way their past will automatically make them act, because we all have that.
Donna and I had once, we actually took a master class on setting with Susan Meissner, which
Hmm.
if anyone, people who watch this know, we tend to, we love her. But she had recommended, and I think it makes a lot of sense when you're choosing kind of those larger settings, like if something that where a lot of action takes place, like
Hmm.
the main home or the nightclub or whatever, that your description of it should kind of reflect back on the character. Um,
Exactly. Yes.
so that if you have a
Yes.
happy character, you're going to want to describe the images around it should be more happy and bright and colorful. They're a reflection, or they were a reflection of the theme and the story itself. You know, if like a
Hmm.
trapped person, you want to use words and descriptions that make them feel tight.
Like I just read, and I don't have them in front of me, but I just read Lisa Jewell's The Family Upstairs and the Family Remains. And there's a house that is central to both of those books. They're linked together.
Great books
And the
for me.
things that these, yeah, they are. The things that those characters go through, every one of the points of view have a different interpretation of the house because their history with that house is different. So you can have five kids growing up in the same house, and they will all have different interpretations of each room in that house because they had different experiences. Like when I was a little girl, we had this really mean cat that would chase me down the hall and try to scratch me. That cat was gone by the time my brother got to that age. So every time I walked down that hall, every time, and I'm 55 now, I think of that cat and I think of it chasing after me and how scared I used to be when I was like 5 years old to walk down there. Now, my brother doesn't even think about that because he never had that experience. So when you have even a house like that, it may be intimidating or cold or scary to one character and not to another. Another may find it to be a sense of home or a happiness for them because they had a different life there.
Okay, let's talk about then word choice for a bit before we go to mistake, because the words you use, you want to choose words that fit the character's point of view, and you
Yes,
want to
yes.
use correct describe your setting based on their feelings in the moment. Correct?
Right, right. Yes, so it'll be twofold. Like if you have a guy, a male character who is a contractor and he walks into a house, he's going to notice totally different things than a female character who's an interior decorator, for instance, or who's an accountant. They're all going to notice different things based on their profession, based on their history. If this is a place that has bad karma for them or something that reminds them of a place that had a bad moment, all of those things will be in their point of view. I remember learning this with my very first book because my male character was a contractor. And I remember him likening things to contracting carpentry type terms because that's how he would look at the world. This is his main life experience is carpentry. And so he's looking at things like insulation or foundations or structures, all of that. Whereas the female character is a flower designer. So she's looking at things from a beauty design standpoint. So their descriptions in their narrative were different. And your reader should be able to tell the difference between them without you ever naming whose point of view it is. They should be able to tell, oh, this must be her because she's looking at things in a different way than he is.
And it should reflect their mood too, because if someone is
Hmm.
feeling, like I said, feeling trapped or sad, something like that, they are what the way they're going to see things around, they're going to pick up the negative details. And
Hmm.
you know, the room that looks cozy and quaint in one scene, they, if they're feeling good, may in the next scene you use the adjectives of tight and dark and shadowy, dingy, because that's how they feel, and it's got to reflect them. Because the setting is a character in itself.
Right, exactly. What you see is what becomes, right? Like if you
Mhm.
always think negative thoughts, your life becomes more negative. And you can also have that as a growth moment in the book for your character because the character may walk into this room at the beginning of the book, in the middle of the book, and at the end of the book and have totally different reactions. Like if you have a character that's overcoming trauma and she goes to this really scary house where things happened and she is intimidated and shy and withdraws into herself and it feels tight and claustrophobic and all of that. And then as she's had some growth through the middle and she comes back to that place and she begins to feel a little bit more ease in the space, a little bit more confident, but not entirely because she hasn't completely gone through her journey. And then she gets to the end and she can walk into that place with confidence and strength because she has changed. So thus her interpretation of the place where she's at has changed.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say using the books, the family upstairs and
Hmm.
the family, what's it, the family
Remains. The family
remain.
remains. Yeah.
Right. Houses play a big deal in that. And like when she's
Hmm.
describing the house in the first book, it is very dark and gloomy and weird and all that. But at the end of the book, there's a different house.
Hmm.
and
Right.
it's
Right.
much warmer, much brighter. Everything about it is described as warmer and brighter. And in the middle, there's an apartment that
Right.
she does is cold and the antiseptic, but she does a really good job of reflecting the mood in each house, as what's going
Exactly.
on in the book.
And each character, if you look at particularly in The Family Remains, Henry's character and Lucy's character, the homes that they choose, because the home was such a big component of the first book.
Yeah.
In the second book, their homes that they choose are so indicative of their character. And even like Lucy picks a house that nobody else would ever pick because she's the one that wants to fix and kind of hug everything in her life and make it better. And Henry has like everything under order and it's all perfect and nothing's ever out of place. And that's very indicative of who they are inside as characters. One's a control freak, one's a little bit more free thinking.
Okay. So let's moving on to mistake number 4, putting in too much description. What do you mean by
Right.
too much?
Well, so just like that thing I talked about with the gunfight, like if you're just describing and describing and describing and you pages it and you think about it and you start walking your scene out, because I'll do that a lot of times. I'll read my dialogue aloud and then I'll do the narrative silently and then I'll note how much time has passed and it seems like okay, so she's describing this room for 4 paragraphs and he's just sitting there staring at her. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense in the real world. So you've got to kind of walk it out and see how much you've done. You also want to look at the white space on your pages because if your reader is used to a certain cadence of writing and a certain pace, if you've all of a sudden got big, dense blocks of description, the reader's going to be like, what? This doesn't feel like your kind of book. So unless you're going to have a really compelling reason for doing that, I would keep with the same pacing and cadence for your descriptions. You also don't want to over describe it because sometimes you've gotten your point across in 2 sentences and you don't need 20. So that's where you really have to learn to show, not tell, for sure, make it much more vivid, impactful, and evocative, and trust your gut. Because if your gut is telling you that you're feeling a little bored reading this or like it drags on just a little bit too long, your gut is 100% right. If you read a lot and you watch a lot of shows and you kind of get an innate sense of structure, you will be able to develop that gut instinct that a lot of people ignore to say this is too much here and I need to cut it back.
Now, would you say there's a difference between commercial fiction, which is your bailiwick, and literary fiction, which tends to be very descriptive heavy? I mean, when you're talking about those dense passages, and I've picked up some literary
Right.
books and gone, "Oh my god," because there's tons. They'll spend like a page and a half discussing the loons, on the lake.
Right. Those loons have like a place in the book, right? If they're describing them, then I hope that the author has a place for them, that it's not just about the loons. Maybe they're a metaphor for something else. But yeah, literary fiction has a little bit more room for that, and that's expected. Just like I was talking about with the white space and the pacing, people expect a literary novel to have a lot more narrative and a lot more description, a lot more language and everything, whereas a commercial fiction novel will kind of move at a faster pace to keep the reader engaged.
Okay,
We're in
flipping
a
it
world
around.
where people have like a 4-second attention span, so you really wanna kinda keep that going.
I'm flipping it over though. How do you know if you have enough description?
I think again, you come back to your gut and you can act it out because if you want a natural pause in the dialogue here, then you can add a little bit of a description while the character's thinking something over or, some big news just hit them. And you also want to look at it and say, am I really pulling every ounce of emotion I can out of this scene? I have a lot of scenes in the book that I'm working on right now where I don't really describe the setting at all because it has zero emotional impact on what's going on. The real emotional impact is in the dialogue. And then there are other places where my character who has social anxiety notices a lot of other things because it's intimidating to her. So that's when I'll slow down a little bit more and expand on it a tiny bit more. So you kind of got to again trust your gut, read a lot so that you kind of develop that innate sense of what works and what doesn't.
Okay, well, and since you were just talking about emotional, bringing emotion, the biggest mistake you say the last one is not wringing every bit of emotion out of the setting. So do you want to
Right,
elaborate?
right. If you're going to use a place in your book and you're going to describe it, then you've got to deliver on that to the reader. So the reader is in there. He or she is invested. They are reading all these words about this great fireplace or this great house or this great tree or whatever it happens to be. You need to use that in all the ways that you can. Maybe the roughness of the bark of the tree reminds her of something from her childhood, or maybe the the shade is just a thing that she's grateful for in this moment when she's hearing really bad news. All of those kinds of things you need to use to bring all the emotion out in the scene. You don't have to use all 5 senses in one scene. Oh, for God's sake, please don't do that
I
because
was
that
just
is
thinking that,
too
I'm like, we're telling you to
overwhelming.
use all 5 senses, and please don't every single scene. Yeah.
No, not all
Or
5.
use the
Just
same senses.
vary them up. Right,
Yeah.
yeah, just vary them up. Sometimes they'll notice a smell, sometimes they won't. We don't always notice all of those things. Sometimes we have to look at how you look at the world and what do you pay attention to? Are you really paying attention to colors or feelings or breezes or what are you noticing when you're in these kinds of places? Because that's what will make you can make the book feel realistic to the reader.
All right, can you give it's off the top of your head, an example of how a setting is bringing the emotion out?
uh,
Words.
Of course, at the top of my head. I'm so bad at that because I read constantly and then I don't even remember like later. I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so I think that in like Ruth Ware's The It Girl, that setting of the prep school that she went to, there's so much in every single scene that is set in the school that they went to that is interpreted differently by the two different characters and how she sees it grows with her as she goes through school because she comes in, she's the poor girl who doesn't really fit in, and then she grows in confidence. And then that emotion comes right back when she goes back there to kind of figure out what happened to her friend. Ruth Ware does a really, really good job with that. If you want a great setting that makes you on the edge of your seat in a dark, dark wood, does that so well. That was my first book of hers that I read, and it's like a overnight party for these girls, and they're in a house that's like all glass.
Oh,
You know something bad is about to happen because she foreshadowed that, and the whole time you're just like, "Oh my gosh, something's gonna come out of the woods." It was so well done. So I
and
would say that in a dark, dark
glass is
wood,
a really good choice.
right? It was. Oh, I think she could have done other things with it, but that wasn't the direction that the book went. I was still on the edge of my seat. I think I read it in one day. It was really, really good.
Okay, I'm thinking a lot like Kelly Rimmer did a book in The German Wife. She
Mhm.
did one of the characters is in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s.
Oh, yeah.
And every time that she goes to that character, there, the woman's got dirt in her hands and her fingernails. She's tasting dirt. There's always some kind of reference to it. And I think that you really
Mhm.
got the hopelessness in every scene because, like they go to visit this local town for the local dinner and it's the only time everyone gets a full meal. And,
Right,
she's talking about the smells of that food. And then she immediately goes back to the original setting where there is no food
right,
and
right.
everything's back to dirty. And so that's a way I look at it. So she really got a lot of emotion out of that scene, out of every single time she used that setting, because you really did feel that hopelessness with the words
Exactly.
she
Yeah,
chose.
and that's a great job that she did with that. It really is awesome. I'll have to read that book in my spare time.
Yeah, in your spare time, you could read that one. Um, and I know I mentioned it earlier, but if we go back, do you do you kind of map out your scene, your settings before like if you have a main setting like a house, um,
Mhm,
I'm thinking about your last trilogy where they all had I can't remember
mhm.
had a home that
Stranger,
they
yeah.
all ended up going in and out of. Did you really think about what that setting was about and how you were going to set it up before and describe it before you wrote the book, or do you kind of just go with what the character's seeing in the moment?
So with that particular book, I kind of went with it on the first one, but then in the next two, I knew that had come back to the setting, and so I had to use it in new and different ways. So I did plan it out more with the second and third book for that. Right now, I'm working on a suspense that's set in a town that is the setting for a whole series I'm planning, and I'm doing a lot of preliminary work on that town, like on the history of it and why it is the way it is and who lives there and all of that, because I know that this setting is so integral to the entire series, and so I really wanna know what it is before I start the book and get really deep into it. And one of the other things I always like to think about is how is the setting impacting the characters and the storyline? So the woods that are in this town are very integral to the plot that I'm working on right now. I don't wanna give away too much because that's the book I do every Friday with the viewers on Ready Compelling Fiction. I do a little bit each week, and, I'm kind of excited about it and terrified at the same time because I'm writing in front of people. But the things that I'm figuring out as I go along are super exciting to me because it's a slightly new genre and a really fun thing.
Oh, very cool. All right, so we should tell again. You have a chapter on settings in your writing compelling fiction book, correct?
Compelling fiction. Yes, I do. I do have a chapter on settings. And I talk about in that book a million times how everything should move the plot forward. Everything should be related to the plot. You just don't waste the reader's time. It is a gift that they are giving you with what they're reading.
So, and even if you're writing heavy literary books, even though it may be heavier with description or heavier and wordier, the same thing. Everything has to, every word has to work.
Exactly. I'm
You know,
just checking to make sure I didn't have any comments that I missed.
yeah, no,
Yes,
but you know
absolutely.
what?
Everything has to work.
If people on my YouTube or on our Step Into the Story Facebook have questions, let us go ahead and type them into the comments even after the show. Shirley, I'm sure we'll come back and answer questions.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and
But I don't rule out that I might use them for a video on writing compelling fiction.
that is true.
So I've got a whole list of questions that people ask me that are sitting there waiting to become videos.
All right, that's fair.
Fair game.
Her website again is writingcompellingfiction.com. Do you have classes coming up, or is it just the mastermind right now?
So I'm going to do some free classes. The masterminds allow are small groups, 15 people max, and the first 5 are guaranteed to get feedback from me, developmental edits on their first 5 pages. And then we kind of build a community. So I'm keeping those groups small so that these people can become friends and support each other. And even in the first meeting, we kind of had some emotion there, and it was really great how the group kind of rallied around the person that was feeling discouraged. And then I'm going to do a lot of the classes that I have offered previously when I've gone and spoken. I'm going to do those for free on my YouTube channel after I turn in the book that's due, because I cannot add another thing to my to-do list until I turn this book in. But sometime towards the middle to end of August, look for some classes on some of the oldies and goodies that I have spoken about throughout the years.
Okay. And so now, going back to our, I have to get the right buttons here. God, I need Donna. Our next episode is August 6th. We're going to be talking about A Botanist's Guide to Flowers and Fatality by Kate Kavari. We met her at the Historical Novel Society. She's such a lovely young woman, and her books both, there's this one and another one. It was called The Botanist's Guide to Parties and Poison. And
Awesome.
it's a 2-book series that came out. It's a series that has a Victorian botanist who solves crimes, which sounds really unusual and really fun. So we're going to be reading that, and we're going to be talking about it at 7 p.m. on August 6th. And after that, I think our guest next month is Eliza Knight, who we adore. And
yes.
And we're going to be talking about her book about Adele Astaire. So hopefully everyone will join us for that one.
Awesome. I have an interview with her that I haven't run on my channel yet. So give me the date when we're done here that you're going to do that. And I'll do that as part of a promo for it. So,
Okay.
I have an interview I did with her at the Historical Novelist Society. So,
and then at the end of the month, next month's writing room, we're going to talk about sagging middles.
Yes, which we all get in our 50s, but it can also happen in your book.
Well, someone actually for sagging middles, I think it was a woman, it was Virginia Cantra who made it, she hit it right. That's when the book stops being fun.
Yes,
and
for sure.
Frequently the sagging middle is because you didn't really think past chapter 4 and you're kind of floundering around, and it's hard. So that's the hardest part of the book. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. It'll be interesting. Donna writes very long books, so she's going to be great at talking about that. All right. So if you liked what you saw today, please like and subscribe us. We're at youtube.com at Step Into the Story Books, or you can join us at facebook.com/groups/Step Into the Story. Thank you, Shirley, for filling in for Donna while she's off having a good time with her husband. And you can come back anytime.
Absolutely. I wish we could do it all in person again, like we did that one episode. That was super fun.
That's it. We need to see you again. So, all right.
Yeah, maybe this winter.
And we'll see you later. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.